Mark chapter 11. There's Bibles available on the back walls and on any kind of flat surface at the back of the room. So if you don't have a Bible with you, you can get up and grab one of those. It's going to be helpful because we are blazing through Mark's gospel in a very short period of time. We're in chapter 11, and we are going to study the whole chapter as a unit this morning. And so you'll want to have it in front of you to follow along. Mark chapter 11. Mark is a gospel. It's one of four gospels that are in the Bible that tell the story about when God came to earth in the person of his son Jesus. The Old Testament tells about how God was relating to a people whom he chose, called out, set apart, and then gave very specific commands to, that they might have a relationship based on faith with him, and that he might display himself through his people to the rest of the world, because he was doing something to make a people for himself out of all the nations. That was the big picture. And his people, Israel, continued to not get that, to be hardened in their hearts, to misunderstand, and to kind of close everything off and close everybody out. And so God did what he always planned to do, what no person could do, what no people could do. He was coming to bring righteousness as a gift for all people who would turn to him by faith. And he did that in the person of his son, Jesus. And four of the people who were followers of Jesus, disciples, became apostles, and their associates. Four of them compiled these different perspectives on Jesus' life. Each of them was written to a different group of people and has a different distinct purpose. And this morning we're studying Mark's gospel. Mark was kind of the understudy or the follower of Peter. Peter was Jesus' closest disciple and the first of the apostles. And so what we're getting is Peter's version of the Jesus story through Mark. And it's been a wonderful journey as we've seen Mark unfold for us really beautifully who Jesus is, as Jesus goes around and does all this powerful, miraculous things and is teaching people, and he keeps saying, don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody, because he's working a plan. And when he comes out with the news, and the news is that he is indeed the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one that God would send, he knew he was going to get opposition from the religious leaders who ultimately would cause his death. And so he was timing this perfectly. And we saw through chapters 1 through 8, Jesus is doing these amazing things and trying to keep it under wraps. And then in chapter 8 and verse 26, Peter sees from heaven that Jesus is indeed the Christ. And when Jesus asks him, who do you say that I am? Peter says, you are the Christ. You are the Messiah. You are the anointed one. And from this point forward, the plot thickens as Jesus starts to assert his Messiah-ness, his Christ-ness, and get the opposition of the religious elite. Now, we're heading into the last week of Jesus' life. It's almost half the gospel. A little over a third of the gospel is spent on the last week of Jesus' life. And chapter 11 is what would normally be read for Palm Sunday, which is 2 Sundays from now. We're a little early. It's because of the way we're moving through Mark's gospel. And the sermon title this morning is the question, who's in charge? Everybody say, who's in charge? That's what's in question in chapter 11. Now, like many sections of the Bible, if you just decide to pick up the Bible and read Mark chapter 11, what you would see is a few little sections, paragraphs, that don't immediately seem to have a whole lot in common, and you may wonder, okay, why are these things put together? But I guarantee you this, all good authors, and specifically the authors of Scripture, they do everything on purpose. And so you want to ask the question, why is Mark 11 the way it is? And what we're going to see is what's called the triumphal entry, happens in verses 1 through 11. And then there's this little story about Jesus going to get some food off a fig tree, and there's no fruit on it, and so he curses it. And then he goes into the temple and flips over all the tables, which is a story most people are familiar with, and drives out all the money changers. And he does a little teaching in there. And then they come out of the temple to see that fig tree withered and dead. So that temple story is in between the fig, kind of bracketed by this little fig tree story. And then in the end, after Jesus gives a short but powerful little talk, there's the religious leaders, the Pharisees, come in and they start charging Jesus with this question, kind of, who do you think you are? By what authority do you do these things? And what you're going to see in Mark chapter 11 is the question about Jesus, who he is, and his authority, his power. But there's also a really important lesson for all of us in there. It's not just a story about revealing who Jesus is and forwarding the plot line about the opposition of the religious elite and how they're going to come against Jesus. It's also really important for us to learn some lessons about authority and ability. Somebody say authority. Authority. So the Greek word that's used for authority is also ability. It's exousia, and it means power. And so power in English means the same thing. Some of us have power because of our position, right? Like right now, I'm standing and talking, and you all are sitting and listening. So I'm exercising a certain degree of power or authority in this place, and you're giving that to me by sitting and listening. You see how that works? Then there's also this idea of strength, right? I guarantee you I'm not the strongest guy in this room. So if we were to have an arm wrestling competition in here, I think Phil maybe or Evan definitely would be taking me down. I'm not the most powerful, strong person present in the room. So there's this concept of ability and authority. Now, Jesus is coming in Mark chapter 11, and we're looking at both of those things. You can think about it this way: power and permission. Both of these two things are wrapped up in the middle of what Jesus is doing here. Now, let me pause to say, human beings are capable of some amazing things, okay? We are made in the image of God. We are given intellectual faculties that far surpass every other kind of creature that God made, and we have strength and agility and abilities that were gifted to us by God. And here's an example of that. Check out this video. This is somebody doing a Rubik's Cube in 28 seconds. But not only doing a Rubik's Cube in 28 seconds, doing a Rubik's Cube in 28 seconds blindfolded. Yeah, watch this. Checking out the Rubik's Cube, looking at all the sides. And go. I want to clap for him. He's not even here. I'm like, oh my gosh, that was amazing. 28 seconds blindfold. You imagine the memory and the faculties that are required, the familiarity with that cube and all of its potential angles and positions. That's mind-blowing, right? So we are capable of doing some serious things. There's power in the human being. But there's also a limitation on our power, okay? For instance, you can't lick your elbow. You can't. Your anatomy does not allow you. Now, somebody who has a very negative ape index, very, very short arms, may be able to lick their elbow, but 99.99% of the population can't lick your elbow. Here's another one for you. If you're sitting down, it's impossible for you to lift your right leg and move it into a clockwise circle. Go ahead, you can try it, all of you who are not ashamed publicly. Yeah, go ahead. Right leg, and now draw a 6 in the air. Oh, your leg turned around, didn't it? Ooh. Ooh, everybody's did. That was weird, wasn't it? I've been trying that all week. I'm like, I can do this. Mind will it. No. Just can't do it. God wired you to not be able to run your appendages in opposite directions. It's crazy. I don't know. So you actually are incapable of tickling yourself? Oh, man. You can tickle somebody else. You can't tickle yourself. Isn't that crazy? And if you want to last one, take your hand and put it on a flat surface, and then put your middle finger down flat like this. If you do that on a flat surface, you can't lift your ring finger. And if you can, I want to meet you, and I want to give you gifts. That's crazy. There's just some things we can't do. And there's a lot of other things we can't do. We all exist in this world where there's tension. And so, not all of us have the ability to do certain things. We have varying degrees of strength and gifting. And so this concept of power and authority, it affects all of us. It's why you obey traffic laws or don't. It's really the gap between these two things is where all morality exists. And this is the really important concept that I want you to get as we get into this text. Morality exists between permission and power. Now, the world wants to feed you a narrative that morality is somehow what's socially best for everyone. Morality has its foundation in God, the person of God. So God in his nature and character is the foundation for all morality. As soon as you remove God from any morality conversation, it becomes so flexible that it's no longer usable. And so morality falls apart because you have to have someone who is granting permission and saying this is permissible and this is not. And then you must have free agents who can agree with that and follow it or disagree with it and disobey it in order for there to be both power and permission. And so morality exists where there's a law, for instance, that you must stop when a light turns red. And some of us, accelerating too quickly towards a yellow light, decide we're going to jump through that light and hope for the best. And so you have the freedom to use your power, acceleration, but that is against the law, right? So you've transgressed the law. There's a morality there. And so righteousness is this. Righteousness, or moral uprightness, is when you subject or submit all of your faculties, all of your power, to what God says is permissible. And that's what Jesus has done and is doing all through Mark's gospel. He is coming on the scene with physical power as a human being, capable of doing all sorts of things, and yet subjecting and submitting himself to all the things God has said is permissible, doing all the positive things God says to do, and not doing the negative things God has said not to do. And that is where righteousness comes from. Now, none of us, the scriptures say no one is righteous in the sense that none of us do that perfectly. And so there's a lot of great people and a lot of good people and a lot of moral people, but nobody perfectly subjects all of their capacity to God's revealed will. And so where there is a gap in that morality, there is unrighteousness. And what we're going to see is that Jesus is going to put on display for us what it looks like to submit your own capacities, powers, abilities to what God has made permissible. Teachers, you can connect to it this way. I have this memory burned into my head from kindergarten, having to go to the bathroom really bad, Miss Becky, can I go to the bathroom? And what would she say? Of course you can. May you go to the bathroom? That's the question, right? Because we're asking about not your ability to get up and go to the bathroom. That's the can. It's, do you have permission? May I, right? Anybody ever teach their parents, or parents who teach your children that? The difference between may I, permission, and can I, ability? Okay, that's what we're talking about here. So here's what we're seeing. Jesus is going to do three things. He is going to exemplify for us in the first section what it looks like to have this humble posture of submitting your power to God's permission. He is then going to command us in his little teaching what happens after he clears the temple, and then he is going to show us where he is the power source as we come to him in humble faith. So let's check it out together. This is section 1, Jesus exemplifying humble faith, verse 1 to 10, or through 11. It says, now when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage, or Bethphage, I guess it depends on whether you're from there or not, and Bethany, at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, go into the village in front of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. Okay, that's grand theft donkey, right? Because if Jesus doesn't have permission to take somebody else's stuff, that's stealing, that's immoral, unrighteous. You guys following? Okay. If anyone says to you, he continues, why are you doing this? Say, the Lord has need of it and will send it back here immediately. See, he's the Lord. He's the one with all the authority saying, hey, I need that. And that's not only mine, you're mine, all this is mine. Right? So we got authority piece coming in. Verse 4. They went away. They found the colt tied at the door outside in the street, and they untied it. And some of those standing there said to them, what are you doing untying the colt? And they told them what Jesus had said and let them go. And they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. And many spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut from the fields. And those who went before and those who followed were shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming King of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. Verse 11. And he entered Jerusalem, and he went into the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. This is a really odd scene, and sometimes we get kind of familiar with it, and so we see this as the triumphal entry, Jesus, the Messiah, entering into Jerusalem, and everybody's affirming, yes, this is him, the forever king, the promised son of David, Hosanna, or praises. Everybody's responding rightly. But what's on display here is how odd Jesus makes his entry. You see, because power for people oftentimes comes from the crowd. It's where peer pressure works. This is where a crowd draws a crowd. We're seeing this in politics right now, this kind of grassroots movement. Suddenly, people are getting power from their popularity. And so a lot of times we use our tools, our articulation, our our winning personality, whatever it is, and we try to get popularity, get support, and the crowd, the people, actually provide power for us, for specific people. And really what happens is, in the world's sense, you end up with the powerful and the powerless. This is why people who are poor, impoverished, without any influence, end up doing hard time for the crimes that the people with all the money get out of with a good lawyer, right? Is this the world we live in? Powerful get away with stuff, the powerless don't. And so the world's not fair. And so what's happening here is Jesus is showing us specifically that he is submitting himself to God's will. And we know this because there's some testimony in the prophets in Zechariah 9, verse 9, about when Jesus, the Messiah, comes into Jerusalem. And here's what it says, Zechariah 9, verse 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king, who Jesus is revealing himself to be, is coming to you, righteous, that is, submitting himself to the permissive will of God, getting righteousness that no one has, and having salvation. We're going to learn how that's coming to us, but look what it says, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. This is a prophecy about what Jesus would do. And so he is obeying God and fulfilling what God had said would happen. It's a picture of his righteousness, and it's a picture of his humility. Jesus had the ability to go get the biggest, baddest horse and put on vestments and a giant sword and march into Jerusalem as the conquering king. He could have done that, and yet he didn't, because he is exemplifying for us what it looks like to be righteous, to have a posture towards God where you are submitting your power and ability to his will. Does that make sense? That's what's happening in this section. That's the main thing. There's lots of other things going on there, but that's the main thing Mark is trying to show us. And he also wants us to see that he's doing this in a very controlled manner. You see, we can read this next section, and it looks like Jesus is losing it in violent fits of rage. And so Jesus wants to make sure that that's not what's happening. Mark wants to make sure we get that that's not what's happening. And that's why in verse 11 it says he goes into the temple and he looks around at everything, and it was late, so he left to go back to Bethany. So Jesus arrives in the temple, checks out what's going on, does nothing, goes home, and then comes back the next day. And this is where Jesus starts to command us to have the same posture as he confronts Israel's unrighteousness. So let's read the next section, verse 12 and following. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it. This is the only destructive miracle of Jesus. He's cursing a tree. Now, if you put yourself in that position, that would just be, you're mad. That's like you go to the vending machine and you really want a Snickers, and the Snickers slot is empty, and you're like, oh, plug that thing, kick the door in, may no one ever eat from this vending machine again. That's not what Jesus is doing here. He's not losing control. He's not acting unrighteously. He's actually providing a picture for the big spiritual reality that's going on. You see, God called a people apart. Just like we are a people called out by God, called to follow him, God has always worked with a people. And in Jesus' time, that people was Israel. And they were meant to be, as we see over and over and over again throughout the scriptures, a vine that bears fruit for the nations, and a life-giving tree that has fruit that's meant to be a benefit to everybody else on the world. And Israel was not that. Israel had all the trappings of what God was trying to do and none of the substance. They were like a tree that was in leaf but no figs. That's what was going on in the temple. And so Jesus does this miracle to draw attention to this spiritual reality, but also to teach us a lesson about faith. That's why Mark brackets it on either side of what happens next. And what we see in verse 15 is that they came to Jerusalem and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. In one of the other occasions when this happened, it said, Jesus made a whip. And so you can imagine Jesus is not losing control. He's very calculated, very purposeful, and he's doing exactly what God wants him to do. Now, here's why it's so important. We had the opportunity to go to the Daytona 500 a couple Sundays ago. I love NASCAR. I love stock car racing, and I love being in Daytona, and had a great time. And we experienced what you would expect to experience. We went there for a long race, and at one point got hungry, and so I went and I ordered a basket of chicken fingers and French fries, and I got my little chicken fingers and my little French fries in a little 5-inch boat, 2 little fingers, and a little thing of soggy fries, $11, right? And you're like, okay, I'm kind of a captive audience here, so just like Disney, I'm paying the money for my little chicken fingers. Yesterday or Friday, we went to IKEA in Orlando. I had the exact same product, $2.49. Different, right? Now, that's just the free market capitalism that we live in. You're going to have our product, you're going to be a captive audience, you're going to pay more. That is not the purpose of the temple. You see, what the religious leaders were doing was they were taking advantage of the crowds, the powerless, to garner for themselves more authority, more wealth, more influence, and they're doing what's evil in the sight of God. Instead of creating, like a living tree, fruit to be a place where people from all over the planet can come and experience the presence of God and the forgiveness of God and the sanctification and salvation of God where He existed at that time in that place in the temple. Instead, they shut the gates and took advantage of everyone and ripped everybody off. That's what was going on. So you don't want to think about this as though dad's coming home from a weekend away to a frat party at the house and gets angry and starts kicking everything over. No, Jesus is saying what's going on in the temple is evil. It's unrighteous. You are taking directions from God, ignoring them, acting with the power and the position that God has granted to you, and taking advantage of the people that you are meant to be providing something to. And Jesus is angry, righteously so, and He is not going to let it happen. And the key is in there in pigeons. Pigeons. This was for the most impoverished, the poorest people would be using pigeons as their offering instead of lambs, instead of larger animals. It was the least expensive, and it was a provision in the law. And so they're marking up the pigeons. Jesus will have none of it. So after He does this, and nobody stops Him, notice. Verse 17. And He was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written? Don't you know that? What God has said is, my house shall be called a house of prayer for the nations." You see, this place existed so people could come in, not be taken advantage of and hindered. But you have made it a den of robbers. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy Him, for they feared Him, because all the crowd was astonished at His teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. You see, the authorities, the religious elite, they get their power from the crowd. And they're also limited in their ability by the crowd, whom they fear. And so there's a very tenuous arrangement going on there. Verse 20, we get back to the fig tree. As they passed by in the morning, they saw a fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." And there's some element of surprise there. So Jesus curses this tree, nothing happens, He walks away. Next day they come back, and the whole thing's all dried up all the way down to its roots. The thing is dead, 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 right? And Peter is surprised. Now Jesus is going to point us to the same posture that He has Himself as He enters Jerusalem. And really, the next two sections are, as we kind of conclude with what Jesus is saying here, available options to us. Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God." Have faith in God. And then He starts to talk about how we get power from God. We don't use the power we have to get more at the expense of other people. We don't create unrighteousness by ignoring God's commands. Instead, we submit ourselves to Him in faith with the power He has granted us, with the freedom He has granted us. And when we do that, something amazing happens. Look what Jesus says. Verse 23. "Truly I say to you, whoever," that means there's nobody who's outside the category of open to this future possibility. So this means you. "Whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes, see the faith, that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. So troubling. I hate that passage of Scripture. It's so misleading. But once you understand why it's there, it clicks, and it'll be super clear. Now, obviously, the first thing we want to do is take this literally. And so I did. We don't have any mountains in Florida, but I have all these palm trees that need to be trimmed, and we got stopped yesterday from being able to trim them. And so yesterday I was on the playground, and so I just decided, without doubt in my heart, I commanded all unnecessary fronds to leave those trees. I did. I told them all, get down and in the fire, all of you. Nothing happened. Are you surprised? Nothing happened? Are you doubting my faith, my sincerity? No, we're not meant to take this literally. All throughout Mark's gospel, Jesus is talking about that which is impossible, and namely, salvation. Hard-hearted Israel, who has all of the intel on God's plan for salvation, doesn't get it, inverts it, closes the door, and rejects the Messiah. Rich people who appear to have the blessing of God and the most righteous life and doing all the things right are now walking away from Jesus, unwilling to identify him as the Messiah and follow him no matter what the cost. And Jesus keeps pointing out the impossibility of faith. You see, we're broken inside. Jesus is commanding us to have faith in God and also recognizing the fact that none of us have the capacity to do that. And he says, if you had the capacity to do that, if you had perfect faith, you could say to the mountains, jump into the sea, and it would do it. It's an impossibility. It's a paradox. And so he's pointing out the fact that there's power to be had in faith. There's power to be had when we posture ourselves in humility before God. We have faith in him, then basically anything that he's permitting you to do, allowing you to do, commanding you to do, he'll give you the power to do it, even if it means pushing a mountain into the ocean. Now, let's apply this. And this is where it's really important to understand calling. Somebody say calling. Calling. Jesus is fulfilling his calling, and that's what the gospel is about. That's what he is, the Messiah. He's making that clear. And the Messiah has a calling, and the calling is to die. You see, Jesus is heading into Jerusalem not to sit on a throne, but to hang on a cross. God's plan for all of time was to redeem a people for himself, to ransom people back, to pay the price that we could not pay, to do for us what we are incapable of doing for ourselves. You see, that's what God is about doing. And that's what Jesus is submitting himself to in faith, posturing himself to do God's will, submitting all of his faculties, all of his power, all of his freedom to the will of God. That's his calling. Now, what's implicit in the text, though, is that every single one of us has a calling. Every one of us. You were created by God specifically on purpose, the way you are, with all of your amazing skills, things that you can do, all of your capacity, all of your quirkiness, all the things that make you you. God made you that way, and when he looks at you, he smiles because he's the Father. And when he looks down at his children, he sees a reflection of himself, and he loves it. Now, we're broken, and he's coming in to rescue us, but each of us has a calling. And when we choose with our freedom to, like Jesus, submit ourselves to his revealed will, what happens is we are empowered in that submission, in that humble posture to walk out our calling perfectly, and nothing can stand in the way. There is no obstacle, no mountain, no obstacle can stop you from doing what God has called you to do when you are walking in faith before him. Do you understand that? And that's what Jesus is getting done. He's saying, listen, there is power in faith. And so if you have faith in God, no matter what he's calling you to do, and this is where the no doubt part comes in. Listen, if God told you that he wants to put a mountain in the ocean, and he's asking you to go tell the mountain to jump in the ocean, and God told you that, would you have any doubt in your heart? Somebody asked me last night, they said, they were talking to me, and we had a conversation, and then they learned that I was a pastor, and I usually don't strike people as the pastor type, and so they go, how did you end up doing this? Because, wow. And so sometimes my eyebrows go up, and I go, man, I tell you what, like, God told me. Like, God doesn't talk to me. I don't, wake up in the morning, yo, God, good morning, what are we doing today? I don't have that kind of, I don't know that God does that, but when I was 18, he broke into my world and said to me, you work for me. Those words, I want you to work for me. Those words came into my brain from outside of my brain, not audibly, but it was clear enough to me that that was God, that I did it, and here I am still doing it. And oftentimes when I want to quit, my wife goes, "Can we quit?" And I go, "He hasn't said I can stop. I can't just stop, so I'm going to keep going. Just keep doing it," right? That's why I'm a pastor, because God told me to. And I'm just going to keep doing that, and I'm not going to stop until he says, "You can stop now." As soon as he does, I'm done. But until he does, here I am, okay? And what's amazing, nothing has stood in the way of me continuing to do this. And there's lots of stuff that should have stopped it from happening. Like my personality, number one, right? My disposition, my faults, the obstacles relationally, all kinds of troubles and problems. Lots of things should have wrecked me as a pastor, and nothing has. And it's not because of me. It's because I'm walking in my calling. I'm trying to say to God, I'm just going to keep submitting all my power, all my thoughts, all my faculties to what you tell me to do, and here's what happens. The world just separates and just makes a way for you to do what God's calling you to do. And that's true for every single person. There is no gap, no shortfall of power when you are submitting yourself to God's will and doing what God wants you to do. And Jesus took this all the way to the end. And in fact, it's through his submission to God's will, through his accomplishing of righteousness, that we can even access this faith. You see, there's this fallacy in this wrong interpretation of this text and the ones that follow it. Because God gives you power, he also gives you permission to where we're the one that get to pick things. And so there's a lot of people that will tell you, like, have faith and then just speak these words and then stuff happens, as though God's like, go for it, you're in charge now. And that's not the way it works at all. We have power to do what God says. We don't have power to do whatever we want. That's not the power that God gives. But there's also this fallacy that because God gives you permission, there's certain things he's told you to do that they will happen without you being a part of it. And that's not true either. If God tells you to do something and then you don't, guess what? It won't happen. And so when he gives you the permission, he's given you the power. He's expecting you to use your faculties to follow him. And that's what this faith in God means. He continues these two things in prayer and forgiveness, and they're super important. Verse 24 says, "Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." You see, he's pointing you to the source of the power. It's not you. It's not your faith. It's him. So your faith is toward him. You receive from him. And then in verse 25, this is really key. "And whenever you stand praying," so now we're doing the thing he's called us to do, orienting ourselves towards the source of this power, he says, "Forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father who also is in heaven," listen to this, "may forgive you your trespasses." You ever notice that "may" in there? You see, God is this way. Sometimes we think God's like all-powerful and therefore does whatever he feels like, whatever he wants, and we kind of like put our human persona on him. But God is all-powerful and yet is confined, is limited by his own character and nature. This is why the scriptures say it is impossible for God to lie, because deceit is not in his nature. You see, there are things God can't do and that God won't do because they're inconsistent with his perfection. Isn't that amazing? And one of the things he won't do is grant forgiveness to those who are unforgiving. I mean, let that sink in for a second. What he's saying is, this faith, this disposition towards God, opens a door in your soul for the forgiveness of God to come in. And when you choose to not forgive others, you close that door. Now that is powerful. And so what he's saying here is, when you have faith and you have a disposition towards God to do whatever he says, you want to get down to the hardest part, the most intimate part, the part where we live our lives every day, no matter what happens to you at the hands of other people, if you want to be in this right relationship with God, you got to keep that door of forgiveness open. Isn't that profound? And doesn't that bring you back to the same impossibility? Do you know how hard, you know how hard it is to forgive. Not all of us know equally. Some of us have had terrible, horrible, awful things happen to us at the hands of other people. People that should have been trustworthy and looked out for our benefit and our care and our good, and they didn't. They took advantage of that. They exploited us and hurt us. How do we forgive those people? Jesus is always going to point you back, not power, not to faith, but to himself, which is where we close. Jesus provides by humble faith. He is the one who gives it. Look at this last section. And they came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, by what authority, power, are you doing these things? That is, clearing the temple and knocking the tables over and driving everybody out. Or who gave you this authority to do them? See, the guys who are in charge, who have too much fear of the crowd to stop Jesus, are now asking Jesus this essential question: who do you think you are? You can just come in here and disrupt everything and change everything and stop everything. We're in charge. By what authority? And they're using this opportunity to force Jesus into what they're going to call blasphemy. Because if he says God told me to do this, they're going to say blasphemy. And they're going to have him executed. So they're looking to trip him up right here. And of course, Jesus, being God and also epically brilliant, responds beautifully, and I always love Jesus' responses, answers their question with a question, verse 29. And Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. And here's his question. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me. See, Jesus pushes this right back to them. They didn't affirm the baptism of John. They rejected it. But everybody else went after it, and now they get their power from the people. They can't oppose it, otherwise everyone's going to look at them with suspect. So they're in a catch-22. Here's what it says. And they discussed it with one another, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? Can't go that route. But shall we say from man? They were afraid of the people, for they all held that John was a real prophet. So they answered Jesus, we do not know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. And this is Jesus just poking them in the eyeball. Boink! These guys are boiling inside. He's provoking them, and he's provoking them because his role is to come and die at the hands of a hard-hearted people, so that everyone who turns to him by faith might have their hard heart softened. You see, Jesus, on the night of his death, prayed a prayer. He knew that nothing could stop him from fulfilling his calling. He could say to a mountain, jump into the sea. He said, I have authority to lay down my life, and I have authority to take it back up. That's beyond moving dirt. And what he did was he perfectly postured himself with humility before God. In Luke 22, 41 to 43, it says, he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, which is what he just directed us to. And here's what he said, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And what happened next, in verse 43 says, there appeared to him an angel from heaven strengthening him. You see, Jesus stood before that which would be humanly impossible. I don't know that any of us could do what Jesus did. He didn't have the power in himself, but he humbled himself, submitted himself to God, told his Father his heart, and yet submitted himself perfectly. And when he was powerless, God provided the power. And here's the beautiful thing. God doesn't provide angels to strengthen us. He provides his resurrected and powerful Son, Jesus. He's the one who provides the power. You see, sometimes we equate humility and faith with weakness, and we become the powerless, and we give power over to other people, and the world will hold out for you. No, if you want to be successful, if you want to be powerful, you use the tools you have to take advantage of, manipulate, exploit, and abuse other people, and that's how you climb the ladder of success. And so the world separates into the top elite and the bottom powerless crowds. But that's not what God says is the final word. You see, he's creating room for morality. He's creating room for you to have power, to have the things he permisses, and then to make choices in between. And he doesn't stop us. That's why there's evil in the world. He lets us do all sorts of things. But the final word is that Jesus, when he comes back to collect those whom he has saved by faith and to bring judgment to those who have sinned against him and others. And so he is making a people for himself that are known by their submission to God's will, who receive power to fulfill their calling, and who spread forgiveness and love everywhere they go. That is the testimony of the church. And this is why we are an empowered missional community. You see, the key part about being the church is being empowered. Empowered to forgive, empowered to fulfill your calling, empowered in prayer, empowered to do what only you can do. And we see that all the time. We saw that this morning. Bill and Jesse are leading worship for us. We're blessed with awesome worship leaders. We got Mike and Darcy and Jordan and Zach and Faded Chariot. We've got Grant and Tiffany Hopkins and John Hellworth and Drew Boyne. We got all these musicians. We're a small church and we got these awesome bands. And Grant's gone and Mike's sick at the last minute, and Bill and Jesse come right in and they use their gifts to serve the church. Empowered, missional, and community. That's what we exist to do. And it's not just in here, it's out there. It's why we go out and make a difference in people's lives. It's why we express the truth of God, welcome people in, forgive other people, bring good news to the world, make a difference in our communities, and we're empowered to do that, and we're empowered by faith. We find forgiveness. We're the ransomed people of God. We are in Jesus. We are joined with him by faith and radically changed in our identity. We are children of God on mission to love God and love other people, and the Holy Spirit moves in and gives us everything we need to do that. And then we do that together and we say, come be a part of what God is doing here. And we are an empowered missional community. And this is what this whole text is about. It's about humble faith that postures you to receive power to fulfill your calling. And that's what I want for every one of you. That's what I want for every single one of you, is to watch Jesus and see what he does, because he exemplifies this humble faith. And then listen to Jesus and listen to what he says, because he commands us into this humble posture. He says, believe God. Nothing can stand in your way. Receive the power he has for you. Turn to him in prayer when you don't see how this is going to work out. And then you know what? Receive the power to forgive. Keep that door open so that you and God are good and that you can be useful, because a closed, hard-hearted, bitter, resentful heart is not getting anything done for God. You see what he's doing here? And then the most amazing thing is, as we do that, he actually gives us the ability to do it. Sometimes we have not because we ask not. Even when it comes to prayer and forgiveness and salvation, we sit back and we go, I hear that, but I don't know. I'm not feeling it. I can't get there. He says, get over here and watch what happens. That's what Jesus says every single time. And so that's where I want to close. I want all of us to take a moment and just contemplate what God's calling is for us and how he's calling us to respond. Let me invite you to just close your eyes. I want to pray for us.